Welcome back. I'm Stephanie Flanders, now head of Bloomberg Economics. And it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, to this session. I feel like I'm introducing him to the industry as well as this session, since this is his first big outing since becoming chairman of the BBC in February. And I can report that he has been very attentively listening to all the sessions this morning, unlike the Director General who just arrived. Because he's so busy, obviously. Richard had a very distinguished 40-year career in financial services, which I'm afraid is now summarized as having been Rishi Sunak's boss at Goldman Sachs. Yes. He served 2 terms on the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee and has more recently been advising Rishi and Boris Johnson on the response to the pandemic, as well as having been chairman of the Royal Society of Arts. He's going to speak for, I'm promised, around 15 minutes, and then we will have a conversation. Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie. Tim told me, actually, before I came to this conference, that I should pay particular attention to Dana's discussion, because she's a superb executive and extremely smart. But I realized, having seen it, that not only is she very smart, but I'm extremely stupid. We have 20,000 people working for us. Now, Dana has many fewer, and yet she managed to find one of her employees who she pays to interview her. Now, so I, by contrast, have a former BBC employee who realized there were far better places to work, and so I'm at a disadvantage. But then again, before I started at the BBC, people did tell me that they sort of specialize in circular firing squads. So maybe I'm better off with an external interviewer than I am an internal interviewer. Now, I'm right now 6 months into the job, and the good news from my point of view is the executive team have been extremely welcoming. And it's not only because I'm not Charles Moore, it's actually also because I think there's a sense that the BBC itself has to be more competitive, and the injection of a little bit of external DNA may be helpful as they navigate the future. And in some ways, I've been through a change in industries before, because I started, as Stephanie said, in the financial services industry, and that's another industry which, through the benefits of deregulation and technology and regulatory change in the Big Bang, experienced tremendous global growth. However, as it focused on short-term growth and value creation, it's pretty clear that it failed to take account of longer-term threats to financial stability. And we all know the catastrophic consequences of the financial crash that followed. And there are parallels to your industry, our industry, which are quite intriguing. Because when I look at the media industry, I see a similar justified excitement with the growth opportunities which technology developments create to those that existed in the financial services industries many decades ago. I also see the UK with a similar opportunity to play or possibly the leading role as the global center of excellence. However, I also see analogous threats to stability. In this case, not financial stability, but social stability, arising from the nature of the growth of the media industry and the direction of travel. Now, it was only 20 years ago, which I can say at my age only, but it was relatively recently that Wikipedia itself was launched, only 20 years ago. And it was seen by many as a sign, and it encapsulated the spirit that the digital era would bring about a great democratization of knowledge. It fit with the philosophy that information would no longer be handed down by a few oracles of fact to the many, and obviously that would have included Auntie, but would now be shared by the many with the many. Hence, knowledge would be open source and owned by all. Now, subsequently to that, and very importantly, social media has developed and become dominant. And with it, a manifestation has become clear that, challengingly, for most people, affirmation is more satisfying than information. Now, of course, the idea that sensationalism sells over sober reporting is nothing new. But it's only relatively recently that we started to understand why. The evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar argues that gossip, in fact, is what makes us human. It releases endorphins, it binds us together in our social groups, it tells us who we should trust. He argues that for primates, the size of your social network is the single most important factor for survival. And it's no wonder that the social affirmation we get from those likes and shares and the volume of those likes and shares is so potent, and that corporations wish to monetize, and for their parts, bad actors, to exploit this need. Now, while we may understand the rewards of this online behavior at an individual level, what it means at an aggregated societal level is clearly concerning. We're now in a marketplace where quality journalism competes on an equal footing with partisan opinion, conspiracy theory, and the deliberate disinformation of bad actors, and frequently losers. It forces us to think again about the relationship between capitalism and the media, and I speak as somebody coming from a capitalist background. And the consequent implications for democracy are profound. It's not merely the current implications which are disturbing, but the threats for decades to come, and we need to look forward in this respect. What do we want this relationship to be in another 20 years' time? Now, in fact, the debate is not a new one. In the 17th century, Milton argued against the licensing of pamphlets in the belief that market forces would drive out falsehoods. He said, "Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." And as recently as 2009, James Murdoch, then News Corp CEO, argued in his McTaggart lecture, which many of you no doubt were at, that the only media regulator should be the market. He said, "The only reliable, durable, and perpetual guarantor of independence is profit." Now, this is a thesis, in my view, that has been thoroughly tested in the US and been found wanting. What began in the late 1980s with the potentially understandable abandonment of the fairness doctrine, which required broadcasters to be honest, equitable, and balanced in presenting issues of public importance, may well, unfortunately, have led to the events we saw in the Capitol in Washington in January. It was a moment that should be seen as a stark warning of the danger to democracy where the media leaves truth contested and a society unable to speak across political divides. There is an economic law in finance called Gresham's Law, whereby bad money drives out good money. And we seem to be perceiving the emergence of an analogous law, Stephanie and I were discussing, maybe Bott's Law, where bad media can drive out good media. And it was Swift who said falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. And it's certainly more true now than in the 18th century when the phrase was coined. This makes disinformation the perfect modern weapon for those who deliberately seek to undermine social cohesion and democracy. And today we see a sinister tactic, which you're all familiar with. The world can be flooded with false narratives. The more confusing and contradictory, the better. People can be encouraged to abandon the idea of truth. Now, in the 20th century, fifth columnists were human agents working within a nation to undermine its solidarity. Today, digital agents are far more numerous, powerful, and insidious. Indeed, we might coin a phrase and call them sixth columnists, agents acting from within, but absolutely controlled from without. Bots seeding disruptive disinformation through many thousands of social media accounts. And policing will only get harder and harder with the rapid advances we're seeing in AI, deep learning, and ultimately the power of quantum computing. We know that deep fakes can be constructed to speak with the voices and faces of real public figures. And in effect, anyone can be made to appear to say anything at all. So where does this leave the tech giants whose platforms have become playgrounds for disinformation? One starting point in the debate is the principle of media freedom, as enshrined in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. But digital platforms have forced new thinking on what types of expression should be able to circulate freely, given clear, real-world harms, from the deliberate spread of vaccine disinformation to the incitement of violence in Myanmar, and there are obviously many others. Most agree there should be pressure on platforms to limit the availability of potentially harmful expression, but fewer agree on how that huge power should be held to account. Just as press barons of the earliest 20th century wanted, as you will know in that famous phrase of Baldwin's words, power without responsibility, today's tech barons have vast power to police their own sites. We heard that in this morning on the YouTube discussion. The question is, what is the responsibility to explain what they block, who they block, and their liability for the content they permit? there is a risk that the policing could be just as democratically challenged as the disinformation they're seeking to combat. And what about the personal data that these platforms hold and exploit? Fundamental to the concept of freedom is not only what we choose to express, but also what we choose not to disclose. And this brings us back to the concerning question of conflicting incentives. A few years ago, when America's biggest food companies met to discuss growing public health concerns around packaged and processed foods, the CEO of General Mills pointed out that they offered healthier products to those that wanted them. Quote, "Bottom line being, though," he added, "we need to ensure that our products taste good, because our accountability is also to our shareholders." And he said, "There's no way we could start down-formulating the usage of sugar, salt, fat, if the end result is going to be something that people don't want to eat." The result we now have is that the US is the most obese of the OECD nations, with around 37% of the country considered clinically obese. Now, it's central to the business model of technology companies that fortunately and unfortunately, they're similarly motivated to serve as a diet of what we want to consume, and an incentive, unfortunately, to cater to our unhealthy wants rather than our needs. Now, in response, some companies have promised greater transparency around their decisions to remove or block content. But as a New York Times editorial recently observed, it's hard to imagine a truly honest accounting when such an accounting would go against their business interests. And Facebook's appointment last year of an oversight board to review decisions on content moderation, whilst welcomed by some as a radical shift, is seen by others as more limited and cosmetic. The issue of who controls the flow of information has even broader implications at a geopolitical level. Look at China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, which continues to build IT infrastructure such as broadband networks across the African continent. It raises serious concerns about recipient countries choosing to adopt a Chinese-style approach to internet governance, which normalizes censorship and blocks the transmissions of ideas. The dangers of national closed media environments such as this are clear, but these days they are not limited to repressive regimes. Each of us has the ability to create a closed media environment of our own. In the last few years, this has proved to be fertile ground for conspiracy theorists, from anti-vax to 5G to QAnon, etc. And where once these theories would bubble away in private echo chambers, COVID in some ways has created the perfect conditions for them to boil over into the mainstream, fed by algorithms that are great at recognizing viral potential, but not so good at spotting nonsense. The pandemic and infodemic that has spread alongside have left us in no doubt how vulnerable we all are and society is. But it has also suggested that some are more vulnerable than others. The magnetic draw of conspiracy theories in our societies is getting stronger. And we can no longer pretend it doesn't have real-life consequences, whether it's pulling down 5G masts, driving down vaccine take-up, or leaving the results of democratic elections in doubt. Extremism can be amplified. But while COVID has shown that the dangers of disinformation have never been clearer, it has also shown, and the BBC represents this, that the demand for high-quality information has never been higher. UK audiences in their millions have turned to traditional sources for news that they can trust. Fact-checking services have been critical in helping to debunk dangerous myths, and many platforms are now collaborating closely with trusted news brands, such as ours, to flag up falsehoods in real time. But candidly, we have to be clear about the limitations. We know that fact-checking skews to an already engaged audience, and that there are plenty of people it simply doesn't reach. Nor can it entirely undo the damage done by disinformation. Prevention is better than cure. And before COVID struck, there was an interesting report from the National Literacy Trust, which found that only 2% of children and young people had the critical literacy skills they needed to tell whether a news story is real or fake. Research suggests that it's this information literacy, the ability to think critically about the avalanche of news we face every day, that can make the biggest difference. Hence, an education of children which prioritizes critical thinking alongside mathematics and basic literacy is now of fundamental importance. This is now the presence of impartial sources. This is how the presence of impartial sources in our daily news diet will hence become increasingly valuable. News that is independent of commercial or political interest, that has an obligation to consider events from all sides and offer the context and analysis to help audiences make up their own mind. Free access to accurate, impartial news is essential as a key factor in building up our resistance against the harmful effects of fake news. If disinformation is the disease running through our societies, impartial news can be the vaccine. And from a BBC perspective, there's clearly a major national and global role here for us as a force for good. The Orwell quote outside our London HQ sums up our commitment to information over affirmation. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Reporting without fear or favour is fundamental to the reach, trust and respect the BBC brand enjoys at home and worldwide. And that's why the board and Tim Davie, our Director General, has identified impartiality as our first priority. Impartiality really is a prerequisite for the existence of the BBC, and it must be seen as a journey, not a destination, something we must prove again every single day. Getting this right is about more than safeguarding the future of a cherished institution that continues to have a critical role to play at the heart of the British national life. It also offers the BBC a chance to define itself globally as a preeminent purveyor of facts in the disinformation age. At a time when news provision has become a key weapon in the battle for global influence, the BBC World Service has historically been one of the jewels in the UK's crown. Our opportunity in the digital age is bigger than ever to deliver information across the globe as a good in itself and as an opportunity to drive UK values of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law worldwide. And as someone who walks past that Orwell quote every time I enter the office, it's hard not to wonder what he would think about the moment we're in. What would the prescient creator of the world of Big Brother think about the world of big data and those who control it? I suspect I know how he'd feel about Eric Schmidt and his comment as Google CEO back in 2009. If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. There are urgent questions to be answered about the future media world we want to live in. We need to rethink the regulatory environment in this country and replace a Communications Act that predates Facebook with one that can deliver on a clear vision. But we also need to look at where the digital world comes up against the fundamental rights, freedoms, and privacies we sign up to as societies and individuals. Does the principle of media freedom need to be redefined and re-enshrined for the digital age? Do we need to claim our personal data as a human right rather than as an asset to be bought and sold? Now is the time to put in place the rights, protections, and education that will safeguard not just our media environment, but the stability of our societies and democracies long into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I like your line about people being more satisfied by affirmation than information is very good. I'm going to definitely steal that.
I need affirmation.
In that whole, and I just affirmed your speech. It obviously was a very big picture, and I think there'll be some people in the audience who are relieved to hear you give such a muscular case for an independent, impartial public service broadcaster. But of course, you didn't mention the words license fee at any point in that speech. Mm-hmm. So I guess if you were going to write a paragraph or a few lines on how that analysis informs your approach to those negotiations that the BBC's now involved in.
Well, I think one of the things just coming into this, and you're from outside the industry, I'd say, is that whilst that change is so dynamic, so quick right now, that the industry needs to lift its head and look into the future and worry about different possibilities. And in my career investing, I dealt with uncertainty. So there isn't just one outcome, there are many outcomes that we can expect, particularly given the pace of change. And so the question is, what certainty do we want to have that there is an institution unaffected by commercial pressures, unaffected by political partiality, that is also in the position of being a resource for the nation and for the world in delivering facts and information, and even beauty and other forms of content in the ecosystem that is a thoroughly well-populated media world with other kinds of institutions. I happen to think that whilst we wouldn't invent the BBC now if we were starting from scratch, the fact that we have it is an incredible asset when you look at this topography that's developing. The only question we have is, will it be a hill or will it be a mountain in relation to some of these other giant mountains that are developing and have developed? And in order for that to be achieved, it needs to be funded. And actually, one of the things that I found most remarkable is the price. I mean, 43p a day for television, radio, website, world service, children, iPlayer, sounds, and a morning argument with your radio is actually fantastic. And that's for a household. That's a fantastic value. Just look at the price of The Guardian. And I know none of you would know the price of the Daily Mail, but look at the price of The Guardian. You know, and it's very, very good, but it isn't. It's 4 times as expensive per day. So it also, I think, contributes to fighting media poverty. And there's so much money in the system because of what people pay Sky, what people are now paying Netflix, what people are paying Prime. And there needs to be a national utility that delivers insight, education, children's, and these other assets at a price point that people can afford. And we can do so because it's imposed. So actually, for individuals and for the world, I happen to think it's a good thing. And then the question is, does the government believe that too? And certainly the issue for me is when I look at your industry and I think, what does the BBC do? I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if at least 20% of this audience, maybe 30%, worked at the BBC. It's populated, it's created skills, it feeds the industry. It's actually a small wellspring from which a large river of capability and activity follows. And as a nation, coming back to broadcast Britain, we should cherish it as a competitive advantage for the industry as a whole.
But you talk about the only question is whether it's a hill or a mountain.
Yes.
That is very much determined by whether you get, for example, a seriously sub-inflation settlement.
Yes, it does.
Or at least in line with inflation. So for you, how much does size matter? How much would you worry about a seriously below inflation settlement? How much does that put at risk what you just analysed?
Well, as your father would say, there would be a hole in my budget. There'd be a hole in my budget. And, because of the demands for your services, media inflation is going up about 9%. So it is an issue. Tim and his team have taken enormous cost out of the BBC already. The low-hanging fruit has gone. There would be serious consequences for a poorly funded BBC.
And going on to the question of impartiality and independence, again, you make that case very strongly in the speech. How can the BBC be truly independent and impartial at a time when, at least with respect to the government, at a time when the government has so clearly got the future of the BBC in its hands? I mean, one is told, and this comes under the journalistic definition of too good to check, that every time BBC officials go to see the culture sector at the moment, he begins the meeting by reminding them that the government has an 80-seat majority. How is it possible to maintain a vigorous independence in that environment?
Well, I think that goes to, do we have integrity as an organisation? And you give up your integrity, you don't have a right to exist. I'm very proud of the fact that on a day I was having a discussion with the Prime Minister, Laura Kuenssberg broadcast her interview with Cummings. The fact is, we take editorial decisions independently and manage the editorial process objectively.
And impartiality, I mean, I know from my experience, is very complicated, and it is something, as you say, it's a journey, not a destination. It has to be proved every day. Sir Robbie Gibb, who was probably one of the best producers I ever had on Newsnight, but he thinks that the BBC has a long way to go. He's now sitting as a non-executive director. We won't go into the details of it, but people will be familiar. He had complaints about someone coming into the executive news editor role. Does the BBC prove its impartiality by ignoring him or by hiring someone in that role who has less political baggage? In
the role as a board member, you mean?
No, of the executive news editor. There's Jess Brown.
Oh, I see.
The appointment of her.
Oh, I see. Look, first of all, just as a boost, you should all watch Newsnight tomorrow night, where there's going to be a discussion on this issue. So,
will you be on it?
I don't know yet. I don't know.
I'm sure they'd love to book you for it.
I have my doubts. Anyway, I tend to get my most hostile questioning from the current BBC employees.
And you wouldn't want it any other way, I'm sure.
No, I would. I would rather not step in front of the firing squad. No, look, everybody has their own opinions. The question is, do they have the individual objectivity to not just look at what they're choosing as news, how they frame it, the context. And the BBC has to fight against the risk of groupthink. I think in your nations and regions issue, what you were hearing was a concern that the media industry, up until now, pretty much, has been incredibly metropolitan. Even if people come from outside London and come into London, and just going to a place like Manchester doesn't move it north necessarily, because it doesn't address people outside the towns. Similarly, Wales and Scotland, other communities, British Asian communities, are they properly represented? So I think there has been an issue of groupthink, which is why, even though we're acting uncommercially in distributing our activity across the United Kingdom, it's really, really good for what our public service is, which is fighting that groupthink. And I think it was Alex who said about the Brexit situation, for example, and I think that was prevalent across the whole industry, was a consciousness that was driven by not enough engagement throughout, and then a groupthink within institutions. So diversity has many different dimensions, and one aspect is to make sure there are different views. But individual recruiting should be on merit, and Jess got there on merit.
But in principle, should they, just in order to fight the groupthink, should one definition of fighting groupthink to not hire anyone who you think might irritate the government?
No. The issue is, in an editorial meeting, does everybody think the same way? Because if you look at the social scientists around groupthink, they recognize better decisions are made when you have different opinions and then there's a conversation. So it's culture, it's groupthink. We have to be open to different views, and we have to make sure that they're aired.
I was struck by you had the US as a cautionary tale for broadcasting, which I suspect not everyone in this room would consider it a cautionary tale, but and having followed the sort of Murdoch maxim of profit, relying on profit. Given that, do you think privatizing Channel 4 makes the world a better place?
Well, look, there's an Ed Burns sort of podcast on NPR, which I encourage you all to live in. He's obviously a great documentary maker, and he talks about that event as one of the great events alongside, let's say, 68 and other, which demonstrate destabilizing. Now, the US is a country with guns. It's most of us are familiar with the coasts. There's the middle, which is a bit different. And there's also a certain kind of culture and spirit associated with how America has developed as a nation, which means that the polarization that I was referring to is particularly problematical there, particularly as people going into their own communities and listening to what they want to. Now, Channel 4 was actually developed in order to bring a differentiated voice at a time that we didn't have that open access to all the different voices we have now. So I think it's a little local issue. When I think about this group should be concerned about Britain's place in the world as an industry which should really be strong globally. Channel 4, who owns Channel 4, will fit into a strategy of one of the big players or not. That we're in a world that's moving, as we heard, so quickly off linear, that is time-stamped in terms of its presence. It doesn't mean it can't make a lot of money on the advertising platform, but I certainly can understand why it may need to now fit in with the strategies of some of the other players. But I don't think that's a big issue. I don't think it will be seen in hindsight as such a big issue by the world as it may be seen by this group.
And you sound like you see no problem, and you're moving on. I mean, you see no problem in principle with it being privatized, and you can see a rationale for it. In the context of your speech, the environment for public service broadcasting.
Look, there will be a consequence of it being privatized, but I think I think that's part of some of the bigger trends which are more consequential to the BBC than that.
And on impartiality, we're going to run out of time, but just for the sake of argument, would you want Andrew Neil back on the airwaves in the BBC, given that he now seems to be a free agent, something of a free agent?
Well, I enjoy watching Andrew Neil, is what I would say. Whether he fits into the BBC is really a matter for that man.
But given the determination not to have groupthink, do you think he would help with that?
What do you think?
And sadly, we've run out of time, ladies and gentlemen. But Richard Sharp, thank you very much.
Thank you.